Jasper Ferraro was 37 years old, and men twice his age lowered their voices when he walked into a room. In Providence, his name opened every door and closed every mouth. He had the cars, the restaurants, the quiet men standing near every exit. What he didn't have was one single person who'd ever looked at him and seen a man instead of a price. So one autumn morning, he did something nobody in his family would have believed. He took off the watch. He left the name behind. He walked into a rundown motorcycle shop in a working-class corner of the city, pulled on a borrowed work shirt with another man's name stitched across the chest, and let the grease work its way into his hands until nobody on that street would have guessed he could buy the whole block twice over. He wanted to know one thing, and there was only one way left to find out. If a woman could love him when he had nothing, then maybe love was real after all. But nothing prepared him for what happened a few weeks later outside a public elementary school on Ward Street, after the morning bell had rung and the last child had gone inside. 5 wealthy women were still standing at the gate. They looked at his torn shirt and his blackened hands, and they decided a man like that didn't belong anywhere near their children. One of them raised her phone and started recording. He didn't say a word. He could have ended all 5 of them with a single phone call, and he just stood there and took it. And then someone came running out of that school and did something that stopped every one of them cold. If stories like this one move you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribing helps us keep bringing these stories your way. Thank you for being here with us. Now, let's go back to that first quiet morning, and the day a man who owned everything set out to find what he was actually worth. 3 weeks before the day Jasper Ferraro first picked up a wrench, he sat in his family's restaurant at 11 o'clock at night, after the sign on the door had been turned to closed and the last server had gone home. The restaurant stood on Atwells Avenue in the heart of Federal Hill, and once a week it closed early for matters no one wanted discussed anywhere else. Bruno Ricci arrived 10 minutes before him. He was 58 years old, had worked for the family since before Jasper could walk, and in all those years, he had never delivered bad news with words. He simply placed the evidence on the table, then stepped back. Sloane Voss arrived 15 minutes late, just as she always did. She sat in the chair across from Jasper and said a few things about traffic, about how she had called him twice that afternoon and he hadn't answered. Jasper let her finish. He didn't interrupt, didn't frown, didn't do anything to show that he was waiting. When she stopped, Bruno stepped forward, placed a phone on the table with the screen facing her, then moved back behind Jasper. On the screen was a photograph of a page from the ledgers of a transportation company the Ferraro family owned through 3 layers of intermediaries. The picture had been taken at a slight angle, the yellow glow of a desk lamp spilling across the upper corner, and along the bottom edge was part of a finger wearing the same silver ring Sloane had on her right hand at that very moment. Bruno swiped to the second photograph, then the third. There were 11 in all, taken over 3 different weeks, and every one of them had been sent to a prepaid number, used by Dragan Kovac's men to receive shipments. Sloane didn't look at the screen for more than 2 seconds. She looked at Jasper. That was what he remembered longest about that night, that she hadn't looked at the evidence because she already knew what was there. She began to speak. She told him about a debt she had never mentioned, about a man who had approached her in the parking lot behind her workplace, about how she had tried to refuse, about how she had meant to tell him many times, but had always stopped herself. Her voice broke exactly where it needed to break. The tears came at exactly the right moment. Jasper listened to all of it, and as he listened, he realized something that left him colder than the betrayal itself. He wasn't surprised. Not one part of him was shocked. He had spent 37 years among people who calculated every move, and somewhere deep inside, he had always been waiting for this day to come from someone, and who that someone turned out to be didn't matter very much. When Sloane stopped talking, the room became so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen could be heard. Bruno stood motionless behind him. Jasper didn't look at him. He didn't look at the phone either. He simply placed both hands on the table and asked her one question. During the past 6 months, was there ever a single minute when you looked at me and didn't see a price? Sloane opened her mouth, then she closed it. She tried a second time, and this time she managed one sound. But it wasn't an answer. It was only the beginning of another explanation, and she knew it too. So she stopped. She sat there with both hands resting in her lap, unable to answer him. Jasper gave one very small nod, as though he had just received the thing he had come there to collect. Then he told her she could leave. Sloane didn't understand at first. She asked him to repeat himself. He repeated those exact 3 words, and added nothing more. She rose slowly, picked up her purse, took 3 steps, then turned back. And in that moment Jasper saw on her face the thing he despised most. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. She was weighing whether she should apologize one more time in the hope of saving something. She decided against it. She walked to the door. The sound of her heels faded along the sidewalk until it disappeared completely. Bruno waited exactly 1 minute before speaking. He asked Jasper whether he was certain. He said she had handed 11 pages of financial records to Kovac's people. And if Carmine learned that the matter had been handled the way it just had, he wouldn't stay silent. Jasper remained seated in the same place. He told Bruno that she had only done what all of them did. She had simply done it better. Bruno didn't answer. In 30 years at the side of this family, he had witnessed many endings to matters like this, and none of them had ever involved allowing someone to walk out the door. He watched Jasper for a long moment, then picked up the phone, turned off the screen, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He asked what happened now. Jasper didn't answer immediately. He sat in the empty restaurant among the chairs turned upside down on the tables, and thought about how he had just listened to the story behind 11 photographs of betrayal, yet the only thing he felt was tired. Not angry, not hurt, just tired. Then he stood and told Bruno to come see him at the house the next morning. There was something they needed to discuss. The next morning, Bruno arrived at the Hilltop Mansion at 7 o'clock. But he wasn't the only person who had been summoned. Carmine Ferraro was already seated at the head of the table, and beside him sat Antonia, who always rose before everyone else in the house, and always seemed to know what was about to be said before anyone spoke. Vito, Carmine's nephew, who had been raised in the house after his father died, sat across from them, with one empty chair between him and the others, his hands resting on the tabletop, properly silent as always. Jasper understood at once that this breakfast had been arranged before he ever entered the room. Carmine let him sit down, let the coffee be poured, and only then said that the matter of Sloan Voss wasn't really about Sloan Voss. He said Kovac had tried 3 times in 2 years, and this time he hadn't bought an outsider. He had bought the woman who sat at the same dinner table as his son. Antonia set down her cup. In the voice of someone discussing the weather, she said the problem wasn't the girl. The problem was that everyone knew Jasper was 37 years old and still had nothing binding him to any kind of structure. And when a man in his position had no ties, people would always find a door through which they could slip. Then she placed the name on the table. Bianca Sartori. 30 years old, the only daughter of the Sartori family, whose people controlled 3 ports and the entire southern freight route through Rhode Island. Antonia didn't use the word alliance. She used the word stability. She said that if the 2 families were joined by a marriage, Kovac would lose both the southern route and his reason to keep testing them, and everything would remain quiet for at least 10 years. Carmine nodded and said that was how his father had done it, and how he had done it, and no one had died because of it. Jasper asked whether Bianca knew about any of this yet. Antonia said her father knew, and that was enough. She didn't ask what Jasper thought. She simply looked at him and waited. And that look made it clearer than any sentence could have that she had already considered the possibility of his refusal and had a plan ready for it. Vito spoke for the first time, saying the Sartori alliance would solve the transportation problem that had been hanging over them since spring, and that he supported it. He spoke briefly, at exactly the right moment, without wasting a single word. Carmine tapped the tabletop in approval, then turned to Jasper and said that 5 years ago, when he had sat in that room deciding who should be given this name, he had chosen correctly, because Vito was good at carrying out orders, while Jasper was good at seeing what lay ahead. Vito smiled and said his uncle was right. No one in the room paid any further attention to it. Bruno waited until the coffee had been poured a second time before delivering his own news. He said there was a federal agent named Nadine Frost, 44 years old, who had transferred from the Boston office more than a year earlier, and she didn't work by storming in and making arrests. She built cases. Over the past 9 months, she had sent 3 requests for documents to 3 different companies, and all 3 companies were on the list Sloan Voss had once been authorized to access. The room fell silent. Carmine asked Bruno whether he was certain the same person was behind it all. Bruno said he wasn't certain, but he didn't believe in coincidences. Antonia was the one who ended breakfast. She rose and said that the more things were tightening around them, the more reason they had to make everything appear normal, and there was nothing in the world that looked more normal than a wedding. She told Jasper to think about it, and the way she said the word think made it sound nothing like a suggestion. He didn't return to the matter for the rest of the day. He met with people at the docks, signed 3 documents, took 2 phone calls about Kovac moving men into the Western District, and by 9 o'clock that night, he returned to his own home, a large house 10 minutes by car from his parents' mansion, with 6 bedrooms, only one of which he ever used. The housekeeper had already gone home. He stood in the kitchen without turning on all the lights and realized he didn't want to sit anywhere in that house. He thought about Sloane's face when she had weighed whether to apologize one more time. He thought about the way his mother had said the word stability. He thought about Bianca Sartori, a woman he had met only 4 times in his life, and wondered whether, when she heard the news, she would think of him or of the 3 ports. Then the question he had avoided for years finally stepped into the middle of the room and stood there before him. If the name Ferraro vanished from him tomorrow, if there were no restaurant, no men standing near the door, no one lowering their voice when he entered a room, what would remain that anyone could possibly want? He had no answer. And what was worse, he realized he had never been given the chance to find out, because in 37 years, he had never once stood before another person without carrying that name with him. He turned off the kitchen light and stood there for a very long time in the darkness. He called Bruno a little after 11 o'clock that night. Bruno answered on the second ring, his voice alert, as though he had been sitting there waiting. Jasper said he needed to disappear for a while. He gave the reason first, brief and logical, saying that if Nadine Frost was building a case, what she needed most was a pattern of behavior she could piece together into a recognizable shape, and a man who didn't appear anywhere for 3 months gave no one anything to assemble. He said everything would continue running while he was gone. Bruno would keep reporting to him, and no one but Bruno was to know where he was. Bruno said he understood, and he said it in the voice of a man who knew he had just been given only half the truth. He asked where Jasper intended to go. Jasper was silent for a few seconds, then gave him the rest, much more quietly than what had come before, saying that he wanted to know what remained of him when he didn't have the name. Bruno didn't answer at once. Then he said it was a bad idea. He said that in the past 30 years, he had watched people die for reasons far more foolish than that, and if someone recognized Jasper in a place where no one stood near the door, there wouldn't be a second chance to learn from the mistake. Jasper said he knew. Bruno asked whether he was going to change his mind. Jasper said no. So Bruno stopped, because over all those years he had learned that arguing with a Ferraro after the decision had been made was a waste of time, and he moved on to the part he did best, arranging things. 3 days later, he produced an address in Olneyville, 15 minutes by car from Federal Hill, and much farther away in every other sense. It was a motorcycle repair shop wedged between 2 abandoned warehouses, owned by Walt Hensley, 64 years old, who opened at 7 o'clock every morning and had never managed to keep an employee longer than 6 months. Bruno said he had already built the cover story. The man coming to work there was the distant cousin of an acquaintance, recently released from prison, in need of a job, and not inclined to ask many questions. He said the cover would hold for only one reason. Jasper had never appeared in a newspaper. There wasn't a single photograph of him online, and outside Federal Hill, almost no one knew his face. They knew only the name. Jasper asked whether Walt knew anything. Bruno said the man knew exactly what he needed to know, and didn't care about the rest. On Monday morning of the following week, Jasper arrived there by bus. He had left his watch in a drawer at home, not because he was afraid of losing it, but because he wanted to see what his wrist looked like when it was bare. The shop was smaller than he had imagined, with an oil-stained concrete floor, 3 motorcycles waiting in one corner, and air that smelled of hot metal mixed with solvent. Walt was bent over a partially dismantled seat. He looked up at Jasper for exactly 2 seconds, asked his name, listened to the answer, then asked nothing else. He merely pointed toward a hook on the wall and told him to get himself a pair of coveralls. Several old sets of work clothes hung there. Walt pulled one down and tossed it to him, and the name Hank was stitched across the chest in faded red thread. He said the kid had quit in the spring. Jasper put it on. It was a little tight across the shoulders and worn pale at the elbows, and he said nothing about the name, didn't remove the stitched patch, and didn't ask another question. Walt didn't explain either. By noon that day, 2 customers had already called him Hank, and both times he had answered. For the first 3 days, Walt taught him almost nothing. He assigned the work and left Jasper to struggle through it alone. On the first day, Jasper spent 4 hours taking apart a carburetor and putting it back together. And when he finished, the engine wouldn't start because he had installed a tiny float, no larger than the tip of his little finger, upside down. Walt looked over his shoulder, picked it up, turned it over, set it back into place, then walked away without saying a word. On the fourth day, Jasper over-tightened a bolt and stripped the threads, and Walt made him stand there and retap the hole by hand for 40 minutes, offering no help and making no comment, merely sitting outside the door, smoking and glancing in from time to time. By the end of the first week, Jasper's hands had begun to change color. It wasn't the kind of dirt that disappeared when washed. Motor oil had seeped into the lines of his palms and hardened around his fingernails, and after scrubbing 3 times with industrial soap, he understood that it was going to remain there, and that it would remain for a very long time. He rented a room 4 blocks from the shop, on the 3rd floor, with a small kitchen and 1 window facing the brick wall of the building next door. He paid in cash. At night, he lay listening to cars passing on the street below, and someone turning on a television in the room beside his, and those were sounds he had never slept with in all his 37 years. Bruno called every night at 10 o'clock, gave his report in 3 minutes, then hung up. No one else knew where Jasper was. On the 10th day, a customer walked in, handed Jasper the keys while keeping his eyes on Walt, and told Walt to have that guy check the rear brake. It happened so often that by the 2nd week, he stopped noticing. People walked into the shop and spoke to Walt about their motorcycles, and if Walt pointed toward him, they looked only in the direction of his finger, never at his face. They handed over their keys while keeping their eyes somewhere else. They asked Walt about the price even when Jasper was the one holding the motorcycle. One man finished paying, then pulled a tissue from his coat pocket and slowly wiped his palm right in front of Jasper before crushing it into a ball and tossing it into the trash can outside the door. A woman brought her motorcycle in on Friday afternoon, and when she saw him coming toward her, she raised one hand and told him to stay a little farther away from it, then called Walt by name. Jasper stepped back twice and waited. By the 3rd week, he realized that the thing he was learning most wasn't how to repair motorcycles. It was what it felt like to stand in a room and not exist inside it. He had never known that feeling before. All his life, the problem had always been the opposite. Then Chloe Vance arrived. She pushed a blue Vespa into the yard on a Tuesday morning. She was 27 years old, worked at a local boutique, and the first thing she said was to ask whether he could believe she had pushed it for 3 blocks, and not one person had stopped to ask whether she needed help. She said it with a laugh, not as a complaint. He wheeled the Vespa inside. She didn't wait outdoors like the others. She followed him in, sat on the plastic chair beside the door, and talked for 20 minutes while he opened the engine cover. She asked his name and called him Hank from the beginning, as though they had known each other for years. She told him stories about her day, including one about a customer who was so particular about a designer bag that she spent 40 minutes inspecting the stitching. She knew how to tell a story. She knew where to stop, and she knew how to leave a single beat of silence before the final line. Jasper found himself laughing. He hadn't laughed in 3 weeks. Before she left, she looked at him and said it was a terrible waste for a man with a face like his to bury himself in a shop like that. She said it jokingly, but she looked straight at him when she said it. She left her phone number on the back of the receipt. He sent her a message that evening. They had coffee 3 times over the next 2 weeks, always at the same cafe on Manton Avenue, always late in the afternoon after the shop had closed. The second time, she brought him a box of cookies her mother had made, saying the woman always baked too many, and Chloe had to give them away before the guilt became unbearable. The third time, she stayed longer, and her questions began to change direction, so slowly that if Jasper hadn't spent 20 years sitting in rooms with people who were measuring him, he might not have noticed. She asked where he lived. He gave her the name of the street. She asked whether he rented the place or was staying with someone. He said he rented it, on the 3rd floor, a small room. She nodded and asked how he got to work, and when he said he walked because the shop was 4 blocks away, she paused for a moment before asking, still lightly, whether that meant he didn't own a car. He said he didn't. She stirred her coffee. Then she asked the final question in the voice of someone merely showing concern for another person's work, asking how much Walt paid him each week. He could have lied. He could have named an amount large enough to keep her sitting across from him for another 3 months, and he knew exactly what that amount would be. But he had come there to learn one thing, and he wouldn't get his answer if he paid to buy it. So he told her the truth, the exact amount Walt handed him in cash every Friday before taxes. Chloe didn't react immediately. She set down her spoon. Then she looked him over, from the shirt with Hank stitched across the chest to the 2 hands resting on the table. hands he had scrubbed twice with soap before leaving the shop, and that still carried black rims beneath the nails, and that look lasted about 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds said everything. She told him he should find another job. She said it gently, almost kindly, as though it were sincere advice she wanted to leave him with before she went. Then she checked her watch, said she had to go home, and left. He sent her a message 2 days later, something short and ordinary, simply asking how she was. The message was read. There was no reply. He never sent another one. He wasn't angry either. He simply sat in his rented room that night, staring at the brick wall beyond the window, and thought that she had actually been very kind, because she had given him an answer more quickly and more clearly than anyone in Federal Hill ever had. The only problem was that he had come all this way, had let oil sink so deeply into his hands that it could no longer be washed away, only to receive the very answer he had left home to escape. On Friday night that week, Walt left early and told him to lock up. Jasper finished working on a chain, lowered the rolling door halfway, then remained seated on the plastic chair beside the entrance with both hands still covered in oil. Outside, darkness had settled completely, and the street was so quiet he could hear the fluorescent lights humming inside the shop. At exactly 10 o'clock, Bruno called. He gave his report in 3 minutes, just as he did every night, his voice even and every word necessary. When he was about to hang up, Jasper spoke and said, "This was meaningless." Bruno paused for a moment, then asked what exactly Jasper thought was meaningless. Jasper said all of it. He said he had been there for 3 weeks, had slept on a thin mattress, had learned to take engines apart with 2 hands that now wouldn't come clean no matter how hard he scrubbed them, and still hadn't found what he had come there to find, because perhaps it didn't exist. And perhaps he was 37 years old and still behaving like a little boy, checking whether there were ghosts in the dark. Bruno let him finish. Then he said only one thing, that Jasper had been there for just 3 weeks. Jasper didn't answer. Bruno continued, saying he wasn't the man who had encouraged this, that he had called it a bad idea from the beginning, but if Jasper abandoned it now, he would carry that question home with him, and it would remain there for the rest of his life. He said 3 weeks wasn't enough time to learn anything about another human being. Then his voice changed, and Jasper immediately understood that the real report was only now beginning. Bruno said there were 2 things Jasper needed to hear. The first was that Kovac had moved men into the working-class neighborhoods on the western side of the city. It wasn't 1 or 2 men testing the ground the way they had during the summer. This time, it was an entire line running through Olneyville, Silver Lake, and down below Hartford Avenue. And they weren't hiding at all. They stood on busy street corners in broad daylight. Bruno said he had sent men down twice to look, and both times they had seen unfamiliar faces. He said Kovac was doing exactly what anyone would do, after noticing that no one had come to answer the door of the house across the street for 3 weeks. Jasper asked whether Vito knew. Bruno said Vito knew. Vito was handling it, and Vito was handling it in Vito's way, which meant quickly and loudly. The second matter came after a pause. Bruno said Nadine Frost had just issued a subpoena for 7 years of financial records from the transportation company on Eagle Street. It was the same company whose ledger pages had been photographed. He said the subpoena had been sent on Wednesday. The attorneys had received it, and they had 30 days to comply. He said she wasn't asking for everything. She was asking for very specific things, and that meant she already knew what she was looking for. Jasper sat motionless inside the shop, listening to the lights hum. He asked Bruno whether he thought he should come home. Bruno answered slowly, and it was the first time in 3 weeks that he hadn't offered an opinion immediately. He said that if Jasper returned now, he would be coming back at the exact moment a federal agent was waiting to see where he appeared and who stood beside him, and that his absence was still useful, regardless of the real reason behind it. Then he added that 30 days was 30 days, and nothing would collapse during those 30 days. Jasper truly considered it. He thought about the dining table at the mansion, and about how the first thing waiting for him if he returned would be the name Bianca Sartori placed on the table a second time, no longer in the form of a proposal. He thought about Kovac's men standing on street corners less than a mile from where he sat, and he thought about how, if he picked up his bag and boarded a bus the next morning, he would spend the rest of his life never knowing the answer. He told Bruno he would stay for 1 more month. Bruno didn't object. He only asked whether 1 month truly meant 1 month, or whether it was Jasper's way of saying he still didn't want to decide. Jasper said 30 days, exactly the length of the subpoena deadline. After that, he would return. Bruno said all right, then hung up. Jasper remained seated a while longer, lowered the rolling door the rest of the way, locked it, and walked the 4 blocks back to his rented room beneath the streetlights. On the way, he passed a corner where 3 men stood with their backs against a wall, and he didn't look at them, and they didn't bother looking at a mechanic walking home with both hands blackened by oil. That was the 22nd night. 3 days later, at 7 o'clock in the morning, a 2009 Honda Rebel broke down 2 blocks from the shop. The woman who pushed it into the yard had $40 in her wallet and 23 children waiting for her at a school on Ward Street. He heard her before he saw her. It was 5 minutes before 7 o'clock. The shop had just opened. Walt was making coffee in the corner, and from the street came the sound of tires grinding over the pavement and the strained breathing of someone pushing something heavier than she could manage. Jasper stepped into the yard. A woman was forcing a motorcycle over a cracked section of sidewalk, both hands gripping the handlebars, her body leaning forward. He walked over, took hold of the rear of the seat, and helped her push it the rest of the way into the yard. She thanked him, lowered the kickstand, then straightened and caught her breath. The motorcycle was a 2009 Honda Rebel. Its black paint faded to gray across the fuel tank, with one mirror replaced by another that didn't match. She said it had died 2 blocks away, that it had begun losing power while she was riding, and then shut off completely, and that she had tried starting it 4 times, before finally giving in and pushing it. He asked when it had last been serviced. She said the previous summer. He unlocked it, turned the key, listened to the weak, dry sound of the starter, then removed the seat to take a look. She stood beside him, watching, not openly impatient, but he saw her glance at the watch on her wrist 3 times in less than 2 minutes. He said it might be the fuel pump, or it might only be the filter and spark plug, and he wouldn't know until he opened it up. She asked how much it would cost. He said that if it was only the filter and spark plug, it would be $85 for labor and parts, but if the pump needed replacing, it would be 3 times that. She said nothing more. She opened her bag, took out her wallet, and opened it right there. And Jasper saw 3 $10 bills and 2 $5 bills inside, laid flat, with nothing else except a few cards. $40. She counted it again with 1 finger, very quickly, then closed the wallet. He had watched many people open their wallets in his life, and he knew the difference between someone choosing what to spend and someone counting everything she had left. She looked at her watch for the 4th time. Then she asked what time the shop closed. He said 6 o'clock. She looked over his shoulder into the shop, where Walt stood holding a cup of coffee, then looked up at the sign outside with the shop's name and phone number painted across a sheet of metal rusted at one corner. He understood what she was doing. She wasn't looking at him. She was confirming that this was a real business, with an address and a phone number, not just a stranger standing in a yard. She gave him her name, Daphne Shaw, and said she taught 3rd grade at the elementary school on Ward Street, a 1.5 miles away, and that she had to be standing in front of her class by 8 o'clock. Then she asked him a question he hadn't been prepared for. She asked whether, if the motorcycle was repaired before noon, he could bring it to the school for her, leave it in the rear parking lot, give the key to the office, and let her pay that afternoon after class. He didn't answer immediately. She misunderstood the silence and quickly said she knew it was an inconvenience, and that if it wasn't possible, she would come back for it later. He said he could do it. She took a sheet of paper from her briefcase, wrote down the school's name and the office phone number, tore it off, and handed it to him. The strap of her briefcase had been repaired with thread of a different color, sewn by hand and sewn firmly. She handed him the motorcycle key as well. She didn't keep a spare, didn't ask his name, didn't request his personal phone number, and didn't give him any further instructions about taking care of it. She simply placed the key in his palm, the oil-blackened hand no one had wanted to touch for the past 3 weeks, and thanked him a second time. Then she checked her watch, tucked the briefcase beneath her arm, and ran. She didn't hurry for a few steps, and then begin walking. She truly ran, down the sidewalk, around the corner, and out of sight. Jasper remained standing in the middle of the yard. In his hand was the key to a motorcycle worth no more than $1,000, and for a long moment, he didn't move. He thought about the shoes she had been wearing, the heels worn sharply to one side, the kind of wear that came from walking often, not riding. He thought about the $40 laid flat inside her wallet. He thought about how, during the past 3 weeks, everyone who had entered that yard had brought something they wanted to take away: a repaired motorcycle, a lower price, an answer about how much he earned each week. But the woman who had just left had come there and left something behind. She had left the one thing no one in his life had ever given him without first calculating what they would receive in return. He stood looking at the corner where she had disappeared for a little while longer. Then he turned, wheeled the Rebel onto the lift, and began taking it apart. It was the fuel filter and spark plug, just as he had guessed, along with a section of wire whose insulation had cracked, which he replaced without charging her. He finished at 8:40. He told Walt he was taking the motorcycle over and would be back, and Walt only nodded without asking anything. Jasper rode the Rebel a mile and a half north, turned onto Ward Street, and reached the school gates at 8:55. The bell had rung long before. The schoolyard was empty, the main doors were closed, and the voices of children drifted only faintly from the second-floor windows. Outside the gate, 5 women remained in a group beside several cars parked along the curb, paper coffee cups in their hands, finishing their conversation after a parent-teacher association meeting that had just ended. Jasper pulled over, switched off the engine, and began pushing the motorcycle toward the entrance to the rear parking lot, just as Daphne had instructed. One of the women noticed him first. She touched the arm of the woman beside her. All 5 turned at the same time. The woman in the middle stepped half a pace forward and asked what he was doing there. He said he was returning a motorcycle to a teacher and would leave the key at the office. She asked which teacher. He said Daphne Shaw's name. She didn't let him finish. She had already turned to the woman beside her and told her to call the office immediately, then pulled out her phone, raised it level with her face, and Jasper clearly heard the tap on the screen as she began recording. She spoke into the phone in a calm, precise voice, as though reading an official statement, saying that it was 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, directly outside the school gates, and that she wanted evidence. Then she turned the camera toward him. She asked whether he could see the sign at the gate, the one clearly stating that all visitors were required to register at the office, while he was standing there dressed in whatever it was he had on. Another woman added that there were places where people could dress like that, and their children's school wasn't one of them. A third laughed and said she didn't dare imagine what might happen if the children came outside for recess at that moment. The woman holding the phone moved one step closer, keeping just enough distance, and said she didn't care who had asked him to come, that his shirt was torn at the shoulder, his hands looked as though he had pulled them out of a sewer, and people like him weren't allowed anywhere within that radius. She went on, saying she had lived in the city long enough to know the kind of men who tended to loiter around schools during quiet hours. Jasper said nothing. He stood still with both hands resting on the handlebars, and in that silence, he thought of only one thing, that he needed to say just 3 words, needed only to speak his last name, and all 5 women would turn pale before he even finished the sentence. No one in his life had ever spoken to him the way they just had. He had never stood on this side of a conversation either. He pushed the Rebel 2 more steps toward the curb, lowered the kickstand, placed the key on the seat, then released the handlebars and turned away. He had taken 3 steps when a side door of the school flew open. Daphne ran outside. She had just taken her class to the art room and was in a free period, still holding a stack of papers, and she ran straight across the yard, through the gate, then stopped directly between him and the 5 women. She stood there blocking them, her back toward him, and spoke loudly enough for the entire street to hear. She said this man had started work at 7 o'clock that morning, had repaired her motorcycle, and had personally brought it all the way there so she could get to class in time to teach their children, and she asked what they had been doing during all of that. The woman holding the phone lowered it slightly. She said Daphne needed to be careful, that she was the president of the Parent-Teacher Association at that school, that her family funded the entire art program Daphne had just taken her students to, and that Daphne was speaking to the person who would be sitting in the meeting about her contract the following month. Daphne didn't step back even half a pace. She said she taught 23 children every day that a person's worth didn't come from the clothes they wore, and she wouldn't stand there and lie to them by remaining silent. She said the shirt was dirty because someone had been working while others stood around drinking coffee. Then she turned, walked over to the motorcycle, picked up the key from the seat, and looked directly into his face. She said, "Thank you, Hank." She said it loudly, every word clear, right in front of all 5 women. No one in his life had ever called his name that way. The woman with the phone was still recording. Jasper gave a single nod, said nothing, then walked away from Ward Street. The video was posted in the school's parent group that evening, and it was no longer intact. The entire beginning had been cut away. Viewers didn't see the motorcycle being pushed to the curb, didn't hear anyone ask what he was doing there, and didn't hear his answer. What remained began at the exact second Daphne stepped out through the gate and raised her voice, and it ended before she finished her final sentence. In those 42 seconds, people saw only a teacher leave her post during school hours, stand in the street, and shout at a group of parents. The caption above it was even more carefully trimmed, saying that a teacher at the school had abandoned her class to defend an unauthorized stranger on school property. By noon the next day, the clip had left the parent group and appeared on 2 neighborhood news pages, accompanied by comments Daphne couldn't bring herself to read beyond the first 3 lines. Whitney Ashcroft didn't stop there. She filed a formal complaint with the district office, signed and dated, written in the language of someone who knew exactly what she was putting on paper. The complaint listed 3 points: that an unregistered individual had approached the school gate during instructional hours, that the teacher responsible had left her assigned position during working hours, and that the teacher had engaged in a confrontation with parents in a public place. In the most literal sense, she hadn't written a single word that was untrue. That was precisely what made the complaint so difficult to undo. On Monday morning, Dorothy Kaminsky called Daphne into her office. The principal was 55 years old and had sat behind that desk for 11 years, and when Daphne entered, she didn't invite her to sit right away. First, she rose and closed the door. She said she had watched the video. She said she had also spoken with 3 people who had been present that morning and knew the video was missing its beginning. Then she placed the complaint on the desk and said that what she knew didn't change what she was required to do with that piece of paper. Daphne asked whether she wanted an apology. Kaminsky said she didn't, but then went on to explain that the school's art program was funded by a foundation to which the Ashcroft family had been the largest contributor for 4 consecutive years, that the school was public, but its budget wasn't enough to pay for even half of what the children currently had, and that she had spent 11 years making sure those funds didn't disappear. She didn't say it as an excuse. She said it like someone describing a rope tightening around her wrists. Daphne sat quietly. Then she said she wouldn't write a statement claiming she had been wrong. Kaminsky looked at her for a long time before saying that in that case, she needed to call the union that very day. The teachers' union representative arrived on Wednesday afternoon, a man carrying a file case and a notebook with curled edges. He sat in the conference room with Kaminsky, a district official, and Daphne for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He didn't argue about morality. He opened the labor agreement to exactly 3 provisions and asked one question at a time: whether the teacher had been in a scheduled free period, whether any student had been left without supervision, and whether the incident had occurred inside or outside the boundaries of school property. All 3 answers favored Daphne. By the end of the meeting, the district concluded that there were no grounds for disciplinary action, but the complaint didn't disappear. It was placed in her personnel file with a note documenting the incident and the meeting that had followed, and when the union representative walked with her into the hallway, he told her plainly that the note would remain there, and that in years when budgets were cut, people always began by reading the files. Daphne kept her job. She also immediately lost the 2 afternoon tutoring sessions she had taken on for extra income, because the parents of both children had been standing at the school gate that morning. Jasper knew all of it. Bruno needed only 4 hours to send him the full name of the woman who had held the phone, her husband's name, the 2 companies they jointly owned, and the 3 loans the Ashcroft family was carrying on 2 developments in the northern part of the city. He read everything in his rented room beneath the single light, his hands still stained with oil. He could end the entire matter with one phone call. No one needed to be threatened, and no one needed to appear at anyone's door. It would take only one call to the right person, and within 2 days, the complaint would be withdrawn, the video would vanish from both neighborhood pages, and Whitney Ashcroft would write a letter of apology with her own hand, without understanding why she was doing it. He picked up the phone. He looked at it in his hand for a long while. Then he placed it face down on the table. He wanted to know how far Daphne could go when no one stood behind her. He turned off the light, lay down in the darkness, and didn't make the call. She came on Friday afternoon after school, still carrying the briefcase with the repaired strap. She placed money on the workbench and counted out $70. She said she was still 15 short and would bring the rest the following Friday when she got paid. She offered no further explanation, and she didn't ask for more time in the voice of someone accustomed to asking. Jasper said it was fine. Walt sat in the corner drinking coffee, looked up once, then lowered his eyes again. Before leaving, she asked whether he was all right after what had happened that day. He said he was. She nodded, said she was sorry he had been dragged into it, then left. The next Friday, she arrived earlier, and this time she carried a plastic container that was still warm. She handed him $15, then set the container on the table and asked whether she could settle the rest with that, her voice only half serious. He opened the lid. Inside was rice with braised chicken and a small portion of stir-fried vegetables, the kind of meal made for 2 people and divided into 3 servings. He said that would do. She stayed for 20 minutes that day because it was raining and she was waiting for it to ease. She asked how long he had worked there. He said a few weeks. She asked what he had done before. He said this and that, and she didn't ask anything else, because she was the kind of person who heard a short answer and understood that someone didn't want to talk. In return, she told him about her class. She told him about a child who read a year and a half behind the others, and had invented his own way of spelling, completely wrong by every rule of grammar, but somehow effective for him, and how it had taken her 3 months to stop correcting him by instinct, and learn instead to follow where he was leading. She spoke about that child longer than she spoke about herself the entire time she was there. After that, she came by every Friday, not because anything had broken, only because the rebel was old and there was always something to ask about. He tightened the chain for her, replaced the rear brake pads, adjusted the light. She always paid, always asked the price first, and pieces of her life began to fall out little by little with each visit. Once, she said her father had died when she was 19. She said he had worked at a printing plant for 19 years. The plant had closed. He hadn't found another job for 14 months, and they had lost the house the following spring. He died before she finished school. She said all of that in 4 sentences, without adding a single word about how it had felt, then asked whether he knew anywhere that sold good used tires. Another time, he asked why she was always in such a hurry on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She said she had to take her mother to dialysis 3 times a week, 4 hours each session. She said Medicare covered most of the medical bills, so he shouldn't worry about that, only that her mother hadn't been able to work for 2 years, that was all. She said that was all in the voice of someone closing a door very gently. One day, she arrived with dark circles under her eyes, and he asked how many hours she had slept. She laughed and said she waited tables at a restaurant on Manton Avenue from 6 o'clock until 11 o'clock at night, 4 evenings a week. He asked why. She said she still owed $61,000 in tuition, and interest didn't care whether she was tired, then immediately changed the subject to the art exhibition her class was preparing. Through all those conversations, he never heard her complain once, not one time. She spoke about the heaviest burdens in her life in the same voice she used to speak about the weather, then immediately returned to talking about the children, and he gradually understood that she wasn't hiding anything. She had simply arranged her life that way, placing everything that belonged to her in the bottom drawer. One Thursday afternoon in the middle of the month, he passed a school supply store on Broadway and saw her inside. She stood at the register holding a shoebox, counting coins in her palm, quarters, counting them twice to be certain. The next morning, he had business near Ward Street and saw the rest from outside the fence. A boy of about 8 sat on the front steps, wearing shoes split open at the toes. Daphne handed him the box and said the school had recently received a donation for students, that she had been asked to choose the size, and that she had guessed his, so he needed to tell her right away if they were too tight. The boy opened the box. He stared at the shoes for a long time, then looked up and asked whether he had to give them back. She said no, they were his now. He took off his old shoes, put on the new ones, stood and bounced twice, then ran a circle around the flagpole simply because he could run. When he came back to her, he was grinning so widely that the gap from his newly missing front tooth showed clearly. Jasper stood on the other side of the fence and watched her bend down to retie his laces, and there was only one number in his mind, $38 and change, counted twice in quarters. He prepared the lie for 3 days, not because it was difficult to invent, but because he wanted it placed at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, with nothing she could seize upon and verify. On Friday afternoon, she arrived later than usual. Darkness had fallen early, and Walt had gone home at 5 o'clock. She sat on the plastic chair beside the door as she always did, and asked why he hadn't turned on all the lights that day. He said he was keeping a few off to save money. Then he allowed the silence to linger for one more beat before speaking. He said he was behind on his rent that month. He said the landlord had already asked twice, that he still owed part of it, and that if he didn't have the money by the following week, he would have to make other arrangements. He said it all in the voice of a man trying to make the situation sound smaller than it was, still wiping a wrench with a rag, never looking at her, She asked how much he was short. He didn't answer that question. He set the wrench down, looked toward the door, and released the sentence he had prepared. He said no woman would ever want to build anything with a man like him. When he finished, he fell silent and waited. For 20 years, he had heard the answers people gave to statements like that, in every form and at every level of skill. He already knew what he was going to hear. She would offer some polite reassurance and then check her watch, or she would ask a few more questions to measure how bad the situation truly was before deciding whether to stand up and leave. Daphne said nothing for about 5 seconds. Then he heard the zipper of her bag. He turned and saw her opening her wallet, the same wallet he had seen inside on that first morning. She took out 3 $20 bills, folded them together, rose, walked over to him, and placed them in his palm. He said he couldn't take them. She said he could. He said he wouldn't accept them. She said it wasn't a gift, then added that he could repay her whenever he had the money, and she didn't need to know when that would be. He stood there with $60 in his hand, and he knew exactly what that money was, because 2 weeks earlier she had told him that her mother's medication, not covered by insurance, cost about $60 each month, and that she always set the money aside as soon as she was paid so she wouldn't accidentally spend it. He asked whether she was certain. She said her mother had enough medicine until the middle of the following week, and she had a shift at the restaurant on Tuesday night, so it would be fine. She said it in the voice of someone who had completed the calculation before ever opening her wallet. Then she sat down again and told him something he hadn't asked. She said that when she was 19 and her family lost their home, 3 people knew what had happened. 2 of them disappeared from their lives that very day. The third was an elderly neighbor from the house next door, a man who had never been close to her family, and he came over, handed her mother an envelope, then went home without saying a word. She said she couldn't remember how much money had been inside. She only remembered her mother sitting on the front steps with that envelope in her hands and crying, and that it was the only time she had seen her mother cry during that entire year. Jasper didn't know what to say. She stood to leave, lifted the briefcase onto her shoulder, then stopped at the door. She told him not to say what he had said earlier ever again. He asked which part. She said the part about the kind of man he was. Then she said, briefly and without raising her voice, that no one owed anyone an apology for being poor, and every honest kind of work carried the same dignity. When she finished, she pulled up her collar and stepped outside, and he heard the rebels start at the edge of the yard before the sound faded down the street. He remained alone in the nearly dark shop. The $60 still rested in his hand, folded in half. 3 old $20 bills worn soft from use. He had spent the first 3 weeks waiting for someone to look at him without seeing a price, and during those 3 weeks, he had concluded that such a person didn't exist. Now he was holding the answer in his hand, and it weighed more than anything he had ever carried. He didn't feel relieved. He felt only something sharp and cold with absolute clarity. That the woman who had just walked away was the only person in his life who had never lied to him even once, while for the past several months he had lied to her about everything, about his name, his work, his room, the clothes on his body, and the past 30 seconds. He slipped the money into the breast pocket of his coveralls beside the place where Hank was stitched, and he knew he would never spend a single cent of it. That night, he didn't call Bruno. He sat on the shop's front step for a very long time, staring out at the empty street. And for the first time since arriving there, he was afraid. He saw them on Tuesday morning. He was carrying a front wheel to a bearing press shop on Ward Street, walking because the distance was short, and at the 4th corner from the school, 3 men stood leaning against the wall of a laundromat that had been closed since summer. They weren't the same 3 he had passed several weeks earlier. These men were positioned deliberately, one at the corner and the other 2 at opposite ends of the sidewalk, and the man at the corner was the only one who spoke to anyone who approached. Jasper counted 4 exchanges in 10 minutes. He didn't stop. He kept walking, brought the wheel back, and that evening, when Bruno called, Jasper spoke before he could begin his report. He gave the street name, the address of the laundromat, described all 3 men, and said the location was exactly 4 blocks from the gates of an elementary school. Bruno was silent for a moment, then asked how Jasper wanted it handled. Jasper said no one was to know where the order had come from, and no one was to see his face connected to any part of it, including their own men. Bruno said he understood. 3 days later, the laundromat on that corner changed ownership. The for rent sign came down, the rolling door was closed, and by the end of the week, someone had replaced the locks, and installed a motion sensor light above the entrance. The man who stood at the corner never returned. The other two disappeared with him. By the following week, a name Bruno had mentioned 3 times during his nightly calls stopped being mentioned at all, and when Jasper asked about it, Bruno merely said the man had moved to Fall River and had no intention of returning to Providence. He said it evenly, and Jasper asked nothing more, because in 30 years, the two of them had never needed to state matters of that kind plainly. The street remained clean for 10 days. But Bruno called again on Thursday night with a completely different voice, and from the beginning, he said this second matter was the one Jasper needed to sit down and hear. He said he had ordered his people to trace the Ashcroft family's money from the day Jasper first asked for their names. He said Grant Ashcroft, 45 years old, was a real estate developer, and over the past 14 months, he had quietly acquired 4 adjoining parcels in the area surrounding Ward Street, each one held under a different legal entity. Together, the 4 lots formed an L shape. The missing space inside that L was the elementary school property. Bruno continued, saying Ashcroft had been lobbying aggressively at the district level, and he wasn't lobbying with an offer to purchase. He had financed an independent engineering report, concluding that the school building, constructed in 1952, had electrical and plumbing systems long past their service life, that the cost of renovation exceeded the building's remaining value, and he had pushed those figures into budget meetings alongside a proposal that sounded perfectly reasonable, that the district should declare the building deteriorated and inefficient, close it, move the students to 2 other schools more than 2 miles away, then sell the land to help cover the budget shortfall. Bruno said that once a public building was declared that way, its sale didn't require the usual form of open bidding, and the man who already owned all 4 surrounding parcels would be the only bidder whose offer carried any real meaning. Jasper asked where Ashcroft had found the money to acquire the 4 lots. Bruno let a long silence pass before answering, and Jasper knew at once that this was the reason he had called. He said the money hadn't come from a bank. It had passed through 3 companies: a construction equipment rental business in Cranston, an industrial cleaning company, and a port logistics firm, and all 3 were on the list they had been watching for 2 years, because all 3 were fronts for Dragan Kovac. Bruno said he had checked the trail 3 times because he hadn't believed it the first time. He said Kovac didn't need to know anything about education. He needed a legal machine through which to move money, and a cleanly documented real estate development backed by a reputable developer was one of the best vehicles in the world for that purpose. He said Ashcroft might know whose money he was holding, or he might not, but that no longer mattered. Jasper remained silent for a long time. He thought about the woman holding the phone at the school gates and the way she had said her family funded the art program. He thought about her husband planning to erase the very school itself. He thought about the 3 men standing on a corner 4 blocks from the gates, and now he understood why they had chosen that exact neighborhood. For 4 months, he had lived as though he possessed 2 separate lives, one bearing the Ferraro name and another with Hank stitched across the chest, and he had believed that as long as he was careful, those 2 lives would never touch. Bruno asked whether he was still listening. Jasper told him to give him 1 week. Then he ended the call and sat in the darkness. And for the first time, he understood that the thing moving toward the school on Ward Street wasn't merely the problem of a poor neighborhood, it was his problem, and it had been waiting there before he ever arrived. He didn't wait for the week to end. He arranged to meet her on Saturday night at a small diner on Manton Avenue, 3 blocks from the restaurant where she worked, the kind of place with 12 tables and a long counter lined with swivel stools. He chose it because it was close, because she wouldn't have to travel far, and because if she wanted to leave in the middle of the conversation, she would lose only 10 minutes walking home. He arrived 20 minutes early and sat at a corner table facing the door. For 3 days, he had thought about where he should begin, and he still didn't know. Daphne arrived exactly on time, took off her coat, sat down, and said he didn't look well. He told her there was something he needed to tell her. She placed her hands on the table and waited. He opened his mouth, and at that exact moment, the bell above the diner door rang. 2 men walked in. They didn't look around for an empty table. They came straight toward him, and by their second step, Jasper knew they were there for him, because no one entered a diner that way when they had come to eat. The man in front stopped about 1.5 feet from the table, leaned down, and spoke a name. It wasn't Hank. He said Jasper's last name, then said his boss had begun to suspect 3 weeks earlier, and now he was standing here. Jasper rose. Everything after that happened very quickly. The table beside them tipped sideways when the second man stepped forward. A stack of plates slid from the counter and shattered across the floor, and everyone in the diner turned to look. Jasper didn't raise his voice. He said only one sentence to the man in front, his voice dropping far below its usual register, and he spoke the name of the man's boss, followed by 4 more words. The entire room froze. The server stopped in the middle of reaching for something. The man in front didn't answer. He stared at Jasper for another 2 seconds, then stepped back, turned around, and both men walked out through the door. The bell rang a second time. No one inside the diner spoke. Jasper bent down, set the table upright, placed 2 bills on the counter to cover the broken plates, then turned back. Daphne was still sitting exactly where she had been, her face drained of color, one hand gripping the edge of the table. He said they should leave. She stood and followed him outside without asking a single question. A black car was parked at the end of the street, and Bruno was already behind the wheel because Jasper had told him to be there waiting from 8 o'clock. She looked at the car. Then she looked at Jasper. He opened the rear door for her, and she got inside. The car moved slowly for several blocks before pulling to the curb in a dark place near the park. Bruno got out, walked several paces away, and stood with his back turned. Jasper told her everything. He gave her his real name, Jasper Ferraro, and explained what that name meant in Federal Hill. He told her about his family, about who his father was, about what he had controlled for 15 years. He told her about the night in the closed restaurant, about the 11 photographs, about the question he had asked a woman named Sloane Voss that she hadn't been able to answer. He told her why he had come to Olneyville, why he wore a shirt bearing another man's name, and that he had gone there to discover one thing: whether there was anyone in the world who could look at him without seeing a price. He didn't speak for long. He didn't apologize in the middle, because he knew that if he inserted an apology, it would become a way of softening everything that remained. When he finished, the car stayed silent for a very long time. Daphne didn't cry. That was the part he hadn't prepared for. She sat upright, looking through the window, and her face didn't move at all. He said her name once. She didn't turn toward him. Then she asked him one question. She asked whether she had been an experiment he was grading. Jasper opened his mouth, and nothing came out. She didn't ask a second time, and she didn't wait. She opened the car door, stepped out, closed it carefully with both hands so it wouldn't slam, then began walking toward the end of the street. Jasper got out after her and called her name. She didn't stop and didn't look back. Bruno came over and asked whether someone should follow her. Jasper said no. He stood there watching her walk an entire block, turn at the corner, and disappear completely. In the pocket of his coveralls, beside the place where Hank was stitched, the 3 $20 bills remained folded in half, and he still hadn't spent a single cent of them. For 3 days, he didn't text, didn't call, and didn't go anywhere near Ward Street. He still went to work, still wore the same coveralls, still took things apart and put them back together as before, and Walt asked no questions even though he could see everything clearly. On Tuesday afternoon, while Jasper was pressing a bearing into place, he heard the rebel enter the yard. He didn't turn around immediately. She set the motorcycle on its stand, walked inside, stopped in the middle of the shop, and said his name, his real name. He set down the hammer. She said she had spent 3 days thinking, and she was going to say this once and then leave it alone. She said she hadn't fallen in love with the clothes. She had fallen in love with the man who had stood silently at the school gate that day and let those women say everything they wanted, even though he could have ended it simply by opening his mouth, and he had chosen not to speak when not one person in the world knew who he truly was. When she finished that sentence, she stopped for a long time. Then she said the second part. She said she was 27 years old and stood before 23 children every day, and she couldn't live in a world where 2 men could walk into a diner and come straight to her table. She said it wasn't because she feared for herself. She said the children in her classroom had home addresses, names, and faces on a list hanging in the hallway, and she had no right to bring anything dangerous in their direction. Then she said the last thing. She said, "I'm staying, but you have to step out, Jasper." He didn't ask how much time she was giving him. He only said all right. He took her to Federal Hill on Saturday evening without warning anyone, and he chose dinner time because he wanted both of his parents to be there. Daphne wore the clothes she taught in. She borrowed nothing from anyone, didn't put on any extra makeup, and when she entered the dining room, she greeted both of them by their full names in an ordinary voice. Carmine allowed them to sit. He asked what she did for a living, and she said she taught 3rd grade. He asked where, And she said Ward Street. He set down his knife and fork. Speaking to Jasper rather than to her, he said he had remained silent for 4 months, had allowed Jasper to disappear without asking a single question, and now Jasper had brought home a woman whose school and whose name both appeared in a formal complaint kept on file by the district. He said anyone looking for Jasper would only need to begin with her and work backward. He called her a vulnerability, using that exact word, and said it in the voice of someone speaking about a door that had been left unlocked. Daphne didn't respond. She sat upright and looked directly at him. Antonia was the one who made the room turn cold. She waited until her husband had finished, then turned to Daphne and spoke in the most courteous voice heard at the table that evening, saying she didn't doubt that Daphne was a decent woman, and that was precisely the problem. She said Daphne had fallen in love with a mechanic named Hank, a man who didn't exist, a man her son had constructed over 4 months, and she had loved that shadow sincerely. Then she said the sentence Jasper would remember for years afterward. She said loving a shadow wasn't love, it was merely being deceived in a pleasant way, and when the shadow disappeared, what remained might not be something Daphne wanted at all. She went on to say that in this house, people didn't marry because of feelings. They married to keep a structure standing, and she spoke Bianca Sartori's name at the dinner table, directly in front of Daphne, without lowering her voice. Jasper told his mother to stop. Antonia didn't stop. She said she would finish because this was the only time it would ever be said. She said that if he chose this woman, he would also be choosing the consequences. And those consequences weren't his parents' anger. They were that he would walk out of that door without the family name, without the right to enter any room belonging to the family, without a single cent from their shared assets, and most importantly, without anyone standing between him and the people who wanted to find him. She said the word protection very softly, as though it were only a minor convenience. Carmine added that Jasper had until the end of the week. Jasper didn't need until the end of the week. He stood, and then he did something no one at that table had expected. He took the ring of keys from his pocket, removed 2 of them, the key to the house and the key to the office on Atwell's Avenue, and placed both on the tablecloth in front of his father. He didn't say a single word. He only looked at his mother for 1 second, then pulled out Daphne's chair, and the 2 of them walked away. In the car, Daphne asked whether he was certain. He said he was. She asked whether he had money. He said he had money of his own, but he wouldn't touch it, because if he did, he would still be that man. She remained silent for the rest of the drive, and when she got out of the car, she held his hand for a while before going inside. Winter came early that year and stayed for a long time. Jasper continued working at Walt's shop, but now it was real work, for real wages, paid in cash every Friday afternoon, and he lived on exactly that money. He didn't touch a single account bearing his name. Bruno called 3 times during the first month. Then the calls became less frequent, not because he had abandoned Jasper, but because Vito had taken the empty seat, and Vito didn't like conversations whose contents he couldn't know. Bruno said briefly that everything now ran through Vito, that Carmine had signed over temporary control, and that there were doors Bruno could no longer open. Jasper told him not to call anymore if it caused trouble for him. Bruno continued calling, only less often. The price arrived in the 5th week. One Tuesday night, someone broke into the shop after closing. No one was inside. The next morning, Walt stood in the yard looking at the 2 rolling doors and 3 customers' motorcycles, saying nothing for a long while, then told Jasper to go buy more locks. Insurance covered part of the damage. Walt absorbed the rest himself, and he didn't ask Jasper a single question about what had caused it, even though both men knew that before November, nothing had happened on that street in 11 years. 3 weeks later, a delivery truck driver stopped coming to the shop. Then 2 longtime customers took their business elsewhere. Nothing happened loudly. Things merely began to slow, steadily and quietly, like water receding from the shore. What happened to Daphne came in January. The district announced a mid-year budget restructuring plan, and within that plan was a reduction in staff at 4 schools, including the one on Ward Street. The cuts were based on seniority and staffing needs. The school's 2nd, 3rd grade teaching position was eliminated. 2 classes were merged into 1, and the person dismissed was the teacher with the least seniority in the group. That person was her. The union representative came for a 2nd time, sat for 3 hours, and opened the same provisions that had saved her before, but this time he closed his case and told her plainly that there was nothing to challenge. No one had violated anything. The reduction was legal, properly carried out, and approved by public vote. He told her the only thing he could do was keep her name on the recall list, and that list would depend on the following year's budget. Daphne thanked him and went home. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She increased her shifts at the restaurant from 4 nights to 6, and she began tutoring 3 children in their homes for less than the usual rate because their parents were struggling too. In February, Eileen was admitted to the hospital. Her blood pressure had fallen during dialysis, and they kept her there for 4 days. During those 4 days, Daphne slept in a chair in the hospital room, went directly from there to the restaurant, then returned from the restaurant to the hospital. Jasper was there almost the entire time. He drove her there, brought her home, carried food to her, and sat in the hallway whenever she needed to be alone with her mother. He paid the hospital parking fees from his wages and never told her. Throughout those 6 months, he didn't complain once. Not once did he say he was tired, that he missed anything, or that some days he had to stand for 8 hours on a cold concrete floor while his back had begun to ache. Not once did he mention anything he had left behind. He simply woke at 6 o'clock, went to work, came home, and appeared wherever she needed him to be. That was the thing that destroyed her. Had he complained, she could have argued with him. Had he blamed her, she could have grown angry and found some relief in it. But he remained silent, and within that silence, she could count every single thing. The name no one called him anymore, the doors he could no longer open, the 2 hands whose knuckles had split that winter from chemicals used to strip away grease. She began to calculate. Before she had pushed the dead motorcycle into that yard, he had possessed everything. Now he had a rented room on the 3rd floor, and a job at a shop someone had recently broken into. At the end of February, on a Thursday night after Eileen had returned home, Daphne sat across from him in the small kitchen and said she needed to talk. He knew immediately from the way she placed her hands on the table. She said she had been wrong. She said that when she had told him he needed to step out, she had thought it was a choice, and now she understood that it hadn't been one. He said he was fine. She said she knew he would say that. Then she said the cruelest thing she had ever said in her life, speaking very slowly, that he couldn't save her by burying himself, and that every day he remained there, he was proving to her that their love was making him smaller. He didn't answer. She continued, saying that if he stayed another 6 months, she wouldn't be able to look at him anymore without seeing guilt. No one raised their voice. No one stood up. The 2 of them sat there in the cold kitchen, exhausted. And at last, Jasper gave one very small nod. He went back for his belongings that same night. When he closed the door behind him, she was still sitting exactly where he had left her, and she didn't come to see him out. He returned to Federal Hill during the 1st week of March. Carmine didn't ask why. He simply pushed a thick file across the table and said that during Jasper's 6-month absence, Kovac had advanced farther than he had expected. Jasper opened it and found what he needed to see, that Grant Ashcroft's development had passed the preliminary review stage and would be brought before the school district for a vote in May. He said he would stop it. Antonia said good, and immediately afterward she said the rest, that if he wanted to stand in a position high enough to stop anything, the structure had to remain standing first. No one used the word condition. No one needed to. 3 weeks later, his engagement to Bianca Sartori was celebrated at the restaurant on Atwells Avenue, with lights, wine, 140 guests, and a photographer circling the room throughout the evening. Jasper stood exactly where he was told to stand, shook the hands of exactly as many people as he was expected to greet, and during those 4 hours, there wasn't a single minute when he was truly there. That same week, 15 minutes by car from Federal Hill, Daphne sat in a community clinic on Broad Street and listened as the doctor told her she was 8 weeks pregnant. For several seconds, she didn't react. Then the doctor turned the ultrasound screen toward her and said there were 2. Daphne asked her to repeat it. The doctor pointed at the screen and counted them for her. Afterward, Daphne sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and she thought about only one thing. Not the money, not how she would manage, but what would happen if he knew. She had lived beside him for 6 months, and she knew exactly what he would do. He would abandon everything again the very next day. And this time he would leave when Vito had already taken his place, when the repair shop had already been attacked once, and when Kovac's men had seen his face inside a diner on Manton Avenue. The first time, he had walked out the door and lost the name. This time, he would walk out with nothing standing between him and them. She sat there and understood that if she told him, she would be the one pushing him into that exposed place. So she said nothing. She gave up her rented room at the end of the month, and moved in with Eileen in a 2-bedroom apartment in Silver Lake. She took on more children for private tutoring, 4 in the afternoon and 2 in the evening, and she gave up her restaurant shifts when she could no longer remain standing for 5 hours at a time. She didn't send him a message. She didn't delete his number either. In Federal Hill, Antonia began to observe. She did it in her own way, which meant she asked no one a single question. At the end of April, the family held its annual fundraiser for the scholarship fund, named after her mother-in-law, a small gathering of about 60 guests, and Antonia placed Bianca in charge of everything. She said this would be Bianca's responsibility from then on, so she should arrange it however she wished. Bianca accepted immediately and said she would handle it. For the next 3 weeks, Antonia didn't interfere once, and she never looked away. She watched Bianca make 2 phone calls and hand the entire affair over to an event planning company in Newport. She watched her ignore the guest list, never ask how many students would receive scholarships that year, and never ask the name of a single child. On the evening of the fundraiser, everything ran smoothly. The lights were in the right places, the flowers were in the right places, and the music was restrained. At nearly 9 o'clock, Antonia stood near the kitchen entrance and saw a young server spill a small amount of wine on Bianca's sleeve. He apologized immediately. Bianca didn't shout. She merely pulled her arm away, looked him up and down, and said one brief sentence, softly enough that only the 3 people nearest them could hear, that if he couldn't hold a tray properly, perhaps he should find work better suited to his abilities. Then she turned away and continued smiling at the guests. The server remained where he was for several seconds before bending down to clean the floor. Half an hour later, when Mr. Sartori rose to offer a few words of thanks and mentioned how thoughtfully the evening had been arranged, Bianca stood beside him and accepted all the praise, saying she had devoted an entire month to it, and that this was only the beginning. Antonia said nothing. She didn't correct her, didn't look toward her husband, and didn't exchange a glance with anyone. She simply remained where she was, holding a glass of water, and watched her future daughter-in-law for a very long time, much longer than was necessary to hear the end of a thank you speech. Then she set the glass on the table and walked toward the kitchen, where the young server was still finishing the cleanup. After the fundraiser, Antonia stopped looking at Bianca as though she were a future daughter-in-law. She began looking at her as though she were a link in a chain, and every link was always connected to something. The first thing she noticed was the way Bianca left a room. Over the course of 4 weeks, on 3 separate occasions, Bianca rose and went outside, and Vito left his seat less than 2 minutes later, never at the same time, never far enough apart to seem unrelated. The second thing was the phone. Bianca always left her phone face down on the table, where everyone could see it. But one Sunday morning, as Antonia passed through the rear hallway of the house, she saw Bianca speaking on a different device, a cheap flip phone, and Bianca ended the call the moment she heard footsteps approaching. Antonia continued walking and asked nothing. On Monday morning, she called a private investigative office in Warwick, a firm she had used twice in 20 years, and paid from her personal account. She asked for only one thing: surveillance and documentation, with no contact. 10 days later, the investigator placed a folder of photographs and a call log on her desk. The log showed that 2 prepaid numbers had contacted each other an average of 11 times a week for 26 consecutive months, beginning before Bianca Sartori's name had ever been placed on Antonia's dining table. The photographs showed a parking lot in Warwick, a seaside hotel in Narragansett on a Wednesday afternoon, and by the final image, there was nothing left to misunderstand. Antonia examined each photograph one by one, neither quickly nor slowly, then closed the folder and remained alone in her study for 2 hours. She didn't call her husband. She didn't call her son. She needed to know how far this had gone before showing it to anyone, because 26 months was far longer than a careless affair, and she had lived in that house long enough to understand that when something remained hidden for that long, it wasn't being hidden because of love. 3 days later, she had an engagement she was expected to attend. Every year, the Family Scholarship Foundation sponsored a free health screening at the community clinic on Broad Street, and every year, Antonia appeared for 15 minutes to have her photograph taken before leaving. She arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning. She crossed the waiting area on her way to the rooms beyond it, then stopped in the middle of the aisle. Along the row of plastic chairs against the wall sat a woman beside an elderly lady, one hand supporting the older woman's back and the other resting on her own stomach. It took Antonia several seconds to recognize her. The face had grown much thinner since the night in Antonia's dining room. The cheeks hollowed deeply, and the belly was far too large to be carrying only one child. Daphne saw her too. Neither woman spoke. Then Daphne rose, perhaps to offer a greeting, perhaps to leave, and she couldn't remain standing. Antonia was the closest person to her. She caught Daphne before she fell completely to the floor, and heard her own voice calling for help, sharper and louder than she had expected. Antonia's car took all three of them to the hospital. The doctor spoke to Antonia in the hallway because she was the one who had brought Daphne in, and because Eileen still couldn't form a complete sentence. He said twins, 34 weeks. He said anemia. He said exhaustion. He said this mother had been working too hard for months and eating too little for weeks. Antonia listened to everything, nodded, thanked him, then entered the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. Daphne regained consciousness about 20 minutes later. She saw Antonia and tried to sit up. Antonia placed a hand on her shoulder and kept her lying down. Then she asked. She asked who the father was. Daphne said, "Your son." Antonia asked why she hadn't told him. Daphne said because if he knew, he would die for us. For a very long time, there was no sound in the room. Antonia asked nothing else. She didn't apologize, didn't explain, and didn't repeat a single word she had spoken at the dinner table that night. She simply sat there, and by the time she stood, her decision had already been made. She didn't take the two women back to Federal Hill. She owned a house in Barrington, held under an old trust that even Carmine had forgotten existed. And within 3 days, she had it cleaned, the mattresses replaced, and additional handrails installed along the stairs. She moved Daphne and Eileen there. She hired a part-time housekeeper and arranged for a maternity nurse to visit twice a week, paying for everything with her own money. She visited 3 times each week, usually in the afternoon, and she never remained for long. No one in Federal Hill knew. No one knew where she drove on those afternoons, not her husband and not her son. On the refrigerator in the Barrington house, Antonia taped a sheet of paper listing the medication schedule in her own handwriting. Under proper care and nursing, Eileen's condition finally stabilized, allowing her to rest peacefully while her daughter prepared for motherhood. The twins were born on a Wednesday morning in late August, 3 weeks before their due date, 1 boy and 1 girl, and both of them began breathing on their own immediately. Antonia remained in the hallway throughout the night. The following morning, she drove back to Federal Hill, went upstairs to the study where Jasper was sitting alone, and said only 3 words, "Come with me." He didn't ask why. She said nothing during the entire drive. When the hospital room door opened, he stopped at the threshold and couldn't take another step. Daphne lay there, thin and pale, and beside her were 2 small bassinets. He turned and looked at his mother. Antonia said, "They're yours." Jasper took 3 steps, then sank to his knees beside the bed. For a long time he couldn't form a sentence, and when he finally could, only short, broken phrases came out, that he was sorry, that he hadn't known, that he should never have left her alone. Daphne reached out and placed her hand over his. She said she wasn't angry with him for leaving. She said she was angry because he had believed the only way to save her was to disappear from her life. Then she said she forgave him, and she said it in the same ordinary voice she had always used when speaking about everything else. That afternoon, Jasper brought his father to the hospital. Carmine stood looking at the 2 babies for a very long time, then bent closer to the little boy, studied his forehead and the distance between his eyes, and recognized the face of his own son from 40 years earlier. The man who had never taken a backward step in his life said 4 words. "I was wrong." He said them to Daphne, and to no one else in the room. 3 days later, the family gathered at the restaurant on Atwells Avenue after closing. Carmine was there, Vito was there, Mr. Sartori and Bianca were there, and Bruno stood behind them. Antonia placed a brown envelope in the center of the table and pushed it toward her husband. Inside were the photographs, the record of calls between the 2 prepaid phones over 26 months, and 3 other things her investigator had uncovered after she instructed him to dig deeper. First, Vito had been the one who gave Sloan Voss's name to Kovacs people, not the other way around. Second, Vito's signature appeared on 2 investment agreements involving the companies behind the 4 parcels surrounding Ward Street, both signed on the same day as Grant Ashcroft. Third, and this was the thing that drained the color from Mr. Sartori's face, the engagement between Jasper and Bianca wasn't an alliance. It was a trap, because once the marriage was completed, Bianca would gain a legal interest in the family's shared assets, and the man who had stood beside her for the past 26 months would have a way inside. Vito denied it. Then he saw his own signature, and he fell silent. Jasper didn't do what everyone in the room was waiting for him to do. He gave no order. The following morning, his attorney called the federal office in Providence, and 3 days later, Jasper sat across from Special Agent Nadine Frost in a room with a recording machine. He turned over the complete files on Dragan Kovac and the money flowing through 3 shell companies into Ashcroft's 4 parcels, in exchange for a conditional immunity agreement covering the activities in which he hadn't participated. Frost read the entire file, closed it, then looked at him and said, "This didn't make him a good man." Jasper said he knew. He said he hadn't come there so anyone would think well of him. The legal process took several grueling months of depositions and probation terms, but Jasper cooperated fully, accepting every restriction required to clean the slate for his family. Vito was arrested in September and charged on the strength of his own 2 signatures. With Vito's treason laid bare, the quiet cloud of suspicion hanging over Sloane Voss was finally lifted, granting her the full exoneration she was owed. Kovac's network was dismantled in 2 operations during the fall. Grant Ashcroft was indicted for money laundering and fraud. The development collapsed, and at the district meeting in November, the board voted to preserve the Ward Street building and provide funding to renovate its electrical and plumbing systems. Early the following year, Daphne was invited back to her former classroom. Whitney Ashcroft came to see her one afternoon in March. After everything was over, she asked for nothing. She only said she had watched the complete video, the part that hadn't been cut, and that she was sorry. Daphne listened to all of it. She didn't gloat, and she didn't repeat a single word that had been spoken at the school gate that morning. She only said the apology didn't belong to her, and it didn't belong to anyone named Ferraro either. It belonged to a working man who had been on the job at 7 o'clock in the morning, and she hoped that the next time Whitney met someone like him, she would remember. Whitney nodded and went home. That summer, a vocational workshop opened on that same street, a non-profit organization offering free motorcycle repair and basic mechanical training to teenagers in the neighborhood, with public financial records and Daphne's name listed on the board. Walt Hensley served as the head mechanic. On the inside wall, beside the rules board, hung a faded old pair of coveralls with the name Hank stitched across the chest in red thread. On the afternoon of the grand opening, after all the guests had gone home, Jasper stood in the middle of the yard with oil still on both hands and asked Daphne the question he had asked only once before in his life, but this time he hid nothing. She said yes. 2 years later, on a late summer afternoon, the twins ran in circles across the grass behind the house, the little girl chasing her brother while both of them laughed aloud. Nearby on the porch, Antonia and Eileen sat together in quiet companionship, watching their grandchildren play. Daphne sat on the steps, finishing a stack of spelling tests. Jasper sat beside her, looking down at his hands, the lines in his palms still dark after all those years, and he understood that the only thing that had ever measured his true worth wasn't the name he carried, but a woman who had stood in front of him when he had been no one at all. There is one truth this story leaves behind, that a person's dignity doesn't lie in the clothes they wear or the work they do, but in the way they treat someone who can give them nothing. We often believe we're judging other people, when in truth, every judgment reveals something about ourselves. And sometimes, the kindest person you will ever meet appears when you have the least. And the only question is whether you are humble enough to recognize them. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it, so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did this story make you feel? And has anyone in your life ever treated you with kindness at the exact moment when you had nothing in your hands? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what comes from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.